When I was 19, I owned a car. I haven't driven since because I never want to go through that ordeal ever again. I was driving at night trying to get home from a friend's place. My friend lived out in the country, so I had to take a backcountry road home. I was never a proficient night driver, so when I got lost, I wasn't surprised. I had tried bringing up Google Maps, but I didn't have my 3G coverage out there. I decided that I was probably going in the wrong direction, just a gut feeling, so I got out of the car to look around. At the time, it was May, but when I got out, it was incredibly cold. The weather had been mild all that week. Even at night, it was brisk at the worst. The second I stepped out of the car, though, I knew everything was wrong. Not only was it unimaginably cold for that time of year, but the woods below the hill my car was on was gone. It had been there just moments before I stepped out, but now, there were 4 large houses where the patch of trees had been. The houses, though, didn't look like houses I was used to seeing in the area. They had domed roofs with a skylight in the middle and what looked like elongated entryways at the front, kind of like your classic igloo. I started to panic and called my dad, but the call went nowhere. I had forgotten that I lost coverage. I then heard a voice below me. I looked down at the houses, and a small floodlight had been turned on in one of the front lawns of the houses. This guy was standing outside with a dog. He was talking to the dog in this language that I had never heard before. I'm no linguist, and I couldn't hear him very well, but I swear it sounded practically alien. Lots of elongated vowels and chirping, for lack of a better word. I was dumbfounded, freaking out. At this point, I was considering throwing myself off that hill, hoping to hit my head and wake back up in my car. I was fully awake, though, freezing and panicked. I rushed back into my car and drove for another few minutes before passing by another car. The car, though, was totally not the kind of car we see today. There was a weird symbol in the windshield and lights accenting the chassis. It had no outboard mirrors and didn't make a normal sound as it passed by. I can't even describe the sound it made. Not a whoosh like normal cars. It was almost like it was slithering. I think the driver noticed that my car was super different too, because as I instinctively slowed down to get a better look, so did the stranger's car. That was it for me. I stopped at the side of the road for a few seconds after it had passed and took a lot of deep breaths. I turned off my car and sat for a long time, but eventually worked up the nerve to get out of the car again. This time it was barely cool out and I could recognize my surroundings. I was a 20 minutes drive away from home. I walked down the road a ways, around a bend and up another small hill, and could see a familiar billboard out in the distance. The problem was that I was way too afraid that I got back in my car, things would change again, so I was determined to stay outside. I thought, just to be safe, I'll open the car door and grab the flashlight I keep in the driver's side door compartment. I walked back down the hill, around the bend, and no car. It occurred to me that after I shut the car door, I hadn't looked back at all. So maybe I had just forgotten its position. I kept walking back, but nope, no car. I checked my phone, and it had been hours since I left, and my parents were surely in bed asleep, so I called my friend, and he picked me up on the road. I told him some made-up story about how the car had died on the road going through the woods on a different, longer route back to my house. I was getting scared in the woods, so I decided to hoof it home. Gave up by the time my folks had gone to bed, so I had to call him. He laughed at my misfortune and apparent stupidity and said he'd help me look for the car the next day. I led my dad and him on a wild goose chase for that car for the majority of the next day before my dad gave up and said it must have been stolen and reported it. To this day, the car hasn't been found because, as far as I know, it's on the side of the road in what I firmly believe to be an alternate dimension, a parallel universe, or what have you. The truth is, I have no idea how this sounds. I've only told my wife what happened, and she thought I was messing with her, and then, after I insisted I wasn't, she thought I was insulting her intelligence. To smooth things over, I gave in and told her it was just a prank or whatever, and she forgot about it. I'm sorry if this sounds too contrived. I just wanted to give the best account of what happened. A few years ago, I was in a hurry to a very important meeting and missed my turn. I got in a turning lane to make a U-turn when my GPS corrected itself and told me just to go straight. So here's where I did something stupid that I'm convinced killed me. There's a double turning lane that has a red light while the straight lanes to the right have a green light. I was stopped in the inner turning lane, so I had to cross another turning lane to get into the lane that was straight. I signaled that I need to get out, and a car lets me into the other turning lane. It was a tight squeeze at a weird angle, so I had no visibility of oncoming traffic. I'm so panicked that I'm late and angry that I just said forget it and pressed the gas. In that moment, I had a prolonged blink accompanied by a sudden shift in pressure. I felt a pop in my head like you get when you're on an airplane. Suddenly, my foot's not on the gas, and I'm back in the turning lane. I look at the lane I was supposed to be turning into, and as I do, a vehicle going at least 60 miles per hour speeds past me trying to beat the yellow light. Had I driven forward, I would have been dust. Unlike a lot of these stories, I didn't experience my own death, but I know for a fact I drove forward. I actually remember driving forward, yet here I was, safely back in my lane, alive. I don't remember the name of the theory, but a while back I read about an abstract idea that our souls will never let us die, and that it will choose the path of least resistance even if that means jumping to an alternate timeline. I wonder if I was glitched into a timeline where I had acted more cautiously. I think about my glitch from time to time and get a little down thinking about an alternate timeline where my wife had to move on from a life she built around me, and how devastated my parents must have been when they got the news. I hug them a little tighter nowadays. In 1993, I was 17 and attended Lollapalooza in Orlando, Florida. I wore black jeans, black military surplus jump boots, and a black Ministry t-shirt from their Psalm 69 tour the year prior, which I also saw in Orlando. Not the most unique outfit at the festival, but this part will become more important later in the story. Primus was the headliner that year. During their set, while I was having a blast circle moshing around in the pit, I accidentally shoulder-checked this guy fairly hard. Back then, mosh pits seemed much friendlier than today. Impacting with others, while expected and unavoidable, was never meant to harm anyone. Whenever you did accidentally run into someone hard or someone got knocked down, it was common courtesy to help them up and check on them. So I accidentally shoulder-checked this guy and immediately spun around to make sure he was okay. And in that instant, it felt like time started to slow down. As I spun around to see him, he too spun around to see me, and when we made eye contact, it felt like everything stopped for a moment. I was looking at myself. Not only did we look the same, we were wearing the exact same clothing that even appeared to be in the same condition. Our shirts seemed to be equally faded, not new. The only detail that struck me as being any different was it seemed as if my hair was slightly longer than his, maybe by an inch or two at most, as if mine had been growing for a few months longer than his. The frozen moment lasted for what seemed like a second or two. Then time seemed to abruptly return, and the crowd swallowed us back up. I didn't see him again. I remember thinking that it felt odd in the moment, but I must have wrote it off. I was likely easily distracted by the music, lights, people, and everything else happening around me. In hindsight, this is always the hardest part of the memory for me to reconcile with. It feels like if something like that happened today, I would have stopped everything and investigated. The best I can figure is that I just rationalized it away as a dumb, distracted teen. After all, it could have just been some other guy wearing the same clothes, right? After Primus was over, I was leaving the concert fairgrounds to head back to my car with my friend, whom I had driven there. Someone laying on a blanket nearby started yelling at us as we walked by. The guy got up, ran over, and started walking alongside us, asking stuff about where we were going, when we were going to meet so-and-so, etc. My friend and I had no idea who this dude was, and had dealt with our fair share of stoned weirdos, so we just ignored him. When he realized we weren't stopping, he sprinted ahead of me and placed both of his hands on my shoulders to physically stop me from moving. He started addressing me by the wrong name and was confused as to why I was acting this way. I knocked his hands off me, told him to back off, and my friend and I kept walking to my car, leaving him standing there staring at me with a shocked expression. At the time, we laughed it off like, man, what was wrong with that guy? But the next day, everything started to make sense once I chatted online with another friend who attended the same festival. This other friend was someone I knew for years but wasn't close with. He was the level of friend where I knew he was at the same show, but I didn't expend any energy looking for him or making plans to meet up or whatever. He initiated the chat and asked if he had done something to anger me. I had no idea what he meant, so he told me this anecdote. He was watching some band at the festival when this crowd surfing guy got past his way and fell down in front of him. He helped him up and realized it was me. He greeted me and tried to give me a hug, but I shoved him away, cursed at him, and then stormed off. He was left completely baffled why I would have acted that way when he thought we were cool. There were two huge problems with this anecdote. One, I never crowd surfed. Ever. Two, at the time this happened, I was with my friend watching a different band at a different stage. What's fascinating is that both my friend during the crowd surfing incident and my doppelganger's friend from the blanket incident were both close enough to each of us to make physical contact and look us squarely in the eyes, yet they both mistook us for the other one. Basically, we've been debating this for the past hour. I work in a software house with about 15 other people. The timeline is this. Friday, December 21st. We're told we can choose to come to work on Saturday and take 24th and 25th off. Most people choose to do this, except one girl whose birthday is on Saturday. Saturday, December 22nd, we go to work. December 23rd, 24th, and 25th are days off. Wednesday, December 26th. We come back to work. The girl whose birthday was on Saturday brings cake, soda, and some snacks. We celebrate her birthday in the meeting room. Now, something that's off about this birthday party is that a girl that's usually extremely friendly says she absolutely couldn't bear to see us all of a sudden. Like a switch just flicked inside her and she felt like she couldn't be there, like she can't stand any of us and she has to be alone. A bunch of us are very close outside of work. This was just something out of the ordinary. Anyway, we eat the cake and there are 2 pieces of strawberry left. The birthday girl eats one and our accountant, Z, wants the last piece. Basically, the girl who felt like she couldn't stand us and Z fight over that piece of strawberry for a while. Afterwards, Z says it's not fair we leave the last and biggest piece of cake to our boss. We all laugh at this because fighting over a piece of strawberry and complaining that the boss gets the bigger piece is a typical thing Z does. I specifically remember Z wearing a tight black dress that day. It all seemed normal until we mentioned this story to Z today. We were talking about how it was weird that the friendly girl felt so disconnected all of a sudden, and Z says there is no way she was at that birthday party because A, she doesn't remember any of this, and B, because she was in a different city for a funeral that day. She had a picture taken on the car ride there on December 26th to prove it. 5 people from the office specifically remembered Z being there, and they remember the strawberry incident. 3 people say they're not sure or can't recall exactly, and we haven't asked the rest yet. I personally remember her being there vividly, and there is only one birthday from October to March in our office, and that's the one on December 22nd. We're absolutely sure the event happened on the 26th, and even the birthday girl remembers bringing the cake on the 26th. It wasn't the office Christmas party because we celebrated it on the 28th, and it didn't happen inside the office at all. We've basically been going over this for hours. There's no way Z could have been there, but we remember her clearly. This happened a few months ago, but I think about it a lot. I was on Reddit after school around 8 p.m. My cell phone started ringing and I saw the caller ID was from my friend Carrie. I answered it, but all I heard on the other line was static. I was planning on texting her, but as soon as I ended the call, my phone crashed. It was very strange, seeing as my phone was at 70% before the call. I kind of shrugged it off and put my phone on the charger. It took a long time to charge. It was still on the black no battery screen when I went to bed. The next morning I woke up late. It makes sense because I use my phone as an alarm. My phone was at 90%, which was good enough for a day of school. I tried texting Carrie on the bus, but I wasn't getting any reception. I decided to just wait to talk to her in person. I met up with her at lunch and she proceeded to ask me, "Did you bring it?" I had no idea what she was talking about. She told me that I had called her last night at 8 and told her about a red shiny rock I found on my front porch. Apparently I promised her I'd bring it to her. I told her about how she called me and my phone being weird, and she had no memory of that. Carrie's phone had record of the call. Mine didn't until I checked back in my phone bill history. After that, my messages with Carrie started working again. I texted her on the bus where I previously didn't get service. Something still feels odd though, and every morning I check my porch for that rock she told me about. I feel like it will turn up someday. In 1935, Air Marshal Sir Victor Goddard of the British Royal Air Force had a harrowing experience in his Hawker Hart biplane. Goddard was a wing commander at the time, and while on a flight from Edinburgh, Scotland, to his home base in Andover, England, he decided to fly over an abandoned airfield at Drem, not far from Edinburgh. The useless airfield was overgrown with foliage, the hangars were falling apart, and cows grazed where planes were once parked. Goddard then continued his flight to Andover, but encountered a bizarre storm. In the high winds of the storm's strange brown-yellow clouds, he lost control of his plane, which began to spiral toward the ground. Narrowly averting a crash, Goddard found that his plane was heading back towards Drem. As he approached the old airfield, the storm suddenly vanished and Goddard's plane was now flying in brilliant sunshine. This time, as he flew over the Drem airfield, it looked completely different. The hangars looked like new. There were 4 airplanes on the ground. 3 were familiar biplanes, but painted in an unfamiliar yellow. The 4th was a monoplane, which the RAF had none of in 1935. The mechanics were dressed in blue overalls, which Goddard thought odd since all RAF mechanics dressed in brown overalls. Strange, too, that none of the mechanics seemed to notice him fly over. Leaving the area, he again encountered the storm, but managed to make his way back to Andover. It wasn't until 1939 that the RAF began to paint their planes yellow, enlisted a monoplane of the type that Goddard saw, and the mechanics' uniforms were switched to blue. Had Goddard somehow flown 4 years into the future, then returned to his own time? I found this sub and thought you guys might enjoy this weird occurrence courtesy of my grandpa. This is the only story he has ever told me that A, wasn't funny, and B, wasn't about the Red Baron, and C, showed him being vulnerable. I think about it every now and then because it honestly is just scary. I was about 16 at the time in 2006, hanging out at his apartment one day inspecting a framed picture of huge snowy mountains with a couple of people in the foreground. He told me it was taken on a trip he was on in the 70s as a young geologist. He and a group of 4 others were flown somewhere in the Arctic, middle of nowhere, middle of the mountains. They had a camp set up far below the mountain range. This place was only accessible by plane or helicopter, it was not regularly visited by other scientists. It was a place where you would have to be documented as having gone there, if that makes sense. One day, he and 2 other guys left early in the morning to ascend one of the mountains to start their research. Cryptic, but it had something to do with rock formations. The other 2 were stationed at the base camp. He said that on the journey back, they were trekking through a long corridor when he distinctly felt like they were being followed or watched. This went on for a couple of hours. They heard noises that sounded like a person whistling loudly as if to get their attention, but they couldn't see anyone or anything and were unable to pinpoint the direction of the sounds. Apparently, the guys did not get the same eerie feeling, but all 3 of them did hear the whistling. At one point, my grandpa looked up to the top of the mountainside that made up one part of the corridor and saw a man, seemingly standing atop a ledge, watching. The ledge must have been several hundred feet high. The man, as he called it, was far away enough that no distinct features could be seen, but it was very clearly a human body standing upright, with hands, legs, and a head. Not naked, but definitely not wearing any kind of gear, in the shadow of the rest of the mountain. Grandpa said that they all started waving and calling out to the man, but got no response or movement. After a while, they gave up and kept moving forward. He said that he felt very tight in his chest and very uneasy. He looked back and saw the figure in the same place, but it was floating a foot or so in the air. He confirmed that the other guy also saw this happen. He said that his body was flooded with fear, like a panic, and the other guys were wanting to move away quickly. After a few minutes at most, he looked back and the man was gone. They waited and saw nothing return. There were no more noises the rest of the way. He said that he had never been more terrified in his life, and he couldn't make any logical sense of it. When they got back to camp, the other 2 guys were still doing their thing. They were all so rattled that no one spoke about it again. They finished the research and were transported off the mountain a few days later. I wish I was better at recapturing how affected he was, even just remembering it. I brought it up to him in more recent times. He still gets really quiet and uneasy. I don't know if it's a glitch, an anomaly, maybe an encounter with another sentient species. It freaks me out and clearly still freaks him out some 45 years later. This happened about 2 years ago. I was in my senior year of high school and we had a snow day and school was canceled. So after sleeping in, I woke up and chilled in bed for a little bit before embarking downstairs for some coffee. I came downstairs and walked past my mom and dad on the couch. She was reading something on her phone and my dad was reading a newspaper. She greeted me, "Good morning." I answered, and I thought it was strange because my dad didn't even look up at me or say anything when I came downstairs. I grabbed some coffee and wandered back into the front room, the living room, and made some small talk that I can't remember with my mom. Still, my dad hadn't even looked up at me. He was just reading the paper. I didn't try to talk to him because he clearly seemed like he didn't want to talk, but it was the weirdest thing ever. My cats were suddenly at the front door. Since there was snow everywhere, my mom rushed to go let them inside, and I followed her, still talking about something unimportant. But out of the corner of my eye, I could see my dad get up with his newspaper and silently wander out of the room, through the kitchen, and into the dining room that leads out to the back porch. I was finally annoyed at him straight up ignoring me for no reason, so I went into the dining room to talk to him, and he wasn't there. I hadn't heard the back door open or close. It's pretty loud, but I figured that maybe I was distracted and missed the sound. Even so, I couldn't see him anywhere near the porch or in the backyard. So I went up to my mom and asked her, "So, what's wrong with Dad?" She kind of looked at me funny and just replied, "Huh?" It weirded me out that she didn't seem to think anything was wrong with him, so I said, "Dad, what's up with him this morning? He just completely ignored me and left out the back door, I guess. What's up with that? Is he mad at me for something?" Then my mom says something confusing as ever. "What are you talking about? Dad's sleeping upstairs." I was getting frustrated at this point and said, "Mom, he was right next to you reading the paper. He completely ignored me and just walked away. So what are you talking about?" Mom goes, "He worked the graveyard shift last night. He's upstairs in bed sleeping. He hasn't even gotten up yet. Are you feeling okay?" I absolutely didn't even believe her. I ran upstairs and looked in their room, and sure enough, he was right there, sound asleep. Something weird happened, whether it was a glitch, doppelganger, or he somehow astral projected and I saw him, but it's the creepiest thing ever. Saw my dad sitting right there, plain as day, could hear the paper rustling as he turned the newspaper pages, and could hear his footsteps, and yet he was asleep the whole time, and my mom never saw him. This is a personal story of mine. It happened around my freshman year of high school in 2011. I was around 13 or 14 years old, and my sister was 4 school grades younger than me. Every day I would come home on the bus, arriving at my house around 2:20 p.m. About a 10, maybe 15-minute ride from the high school to my house. I lived in the countryside, so my stop was ways away from the other neighborhoods the other kids lived in. My house was directly next to a farm, and we only had a few neighbors, all older folk who stuck to themselves. Due to living in a rural area and having an extremely long dirt driveway, when I got home from school I had to walk for a few minutes down the driveway before I got to the back slide door. I would enter my house, lock the door behind me, and put my things down. Every day the same routine when I got home. I would check on my dog's food and water, watch TV in the living room for a little while. My living room window has a perfect view of the front yard of my house as well as the driveway and where the bus would stop at the end of our driveway. Here's where things started getting interesting. While I was watching TV in the living room, I would keep an eye out of the window to watch for my sister to arrive home from middle school and make sure she got off the bus and up the driveway safely. She would get out of school around 2:30 and arrive at my house closer to 3 p.m. I would keep the door locked until I knew she would be home in a few minutes, and then I would unlock it so she could get in the house when she gets to the back door. I did that same thing this day, just like every other day. While in the living room, I saw my sister's bus pull up the end of the driveway, stop, and I watched her get off the bus. I remember she was wearing a North Face jacket, a scarf, and she had her fairly large teal backpack on, jeans and boots. She was walking up the driveway and went out of my view, and I heard the back slider door open, close, and lock as she came into the house. From where I was sitting in the living room, I could see her walk past a doorway down the hall to her room. I yelled out her name and asked her how school was, but got no answer. I got up to follow her and repeat my question. As I walked into the hallway, the very same hallway I had just seen her walk down, I noticed that there were no lights on. The hallway was dark and her room at the end of the hallway was also dark. I said her name again and heard nothing. I turned on the lights and went into her room, and she wasn't there. I figured maybe she went into another room in the house, but I could not find her anywhere. I went back out to check the back door, and to my surprise, it was still unlocked and slightly open, which didn't make any sense because I had just heard my sister close and lock the door when she got home. Confused, I closed the door and locked it and went back to the living room to grab my phone. As I entered the room, the strangest thing happened. Out of the window, I saw my sister's bus pull up, stop, and I watched her get off the bus and walk up my driveway again. When she came in the house, I told her, "The weirdest thing just happened. I saw you get off your bus and come inside and lock the door, but you weren't anywhere near the house. Then I looked outside and saw you get off your bus again. And when I checked the door, it was unlocked and open." She responded by saying, "That's really weird because the door was locked when I came inside and you usually leave it open for me." I explained how I locked it because I thought she was in the house and thought it was really strange that the door was open and unlocked without either of us manipulating it. Might I add, my sister was wearing a t-shirt, a scarf, leggings, and boots, a totally different outfit than I saw the first time. I didn't know what I was seeing or what just happened. I had paranormal experiences in the past, stories that I would be happy to share, but this one really took the cake. I didn't know if this was some kind of entity mimicking my sister and trying to get my attention, or if this was some kind of glitch in reality. But I would love to hear some theories and stories that are similar to mine. The first happening was when I was 18 and working at a credit union in the drive-thru, the ones where we send the tubes out to cars. On slow days, my manager would let us read books or read up on the news when there was no one to help. On this day, it was just me and one girl who was in her early 20s. We didn't have a lot in common since she was really into such things as Grey's Anatomy or gushy romance novels. Today, she had the latter with her that she had just bought at the store on her lunch break. I don't remember the title of it, but I know it was predominantly pink. As I sat reading the news on my computer, she kept laughing out loud as she read her new book. Finally, she can't keep it to herself and starts telling me how funny and clever this book is. Now, I have never seen or heard of this book in my life, and as she talks about it, my mind starts to wander and I wasn't really listening. However, she gets to the point where she says, "Listen to this part," and starts reading directly from it. Then the oddest thing happened. As she's reading the words, I start to hear them in my own head just a couple of seconds ahead of her. After about 15 seconds or so of this, without thinking, I cut her off and finished the next several sentences for her. The words came out of my mouth as if I had the whole thing memorized. I don't remember it all, it was over 12 years ago, but I know part of it was, and I lost my virginity upstairs while my parents were downstairs watching TV. Weird quote to remember from the experience, but it is what it was. After I did that, we both just stared at each other in stunned silence. She knew I hated those kinds of books and had no reason to know anything from that book whatsoever. Finally, she asks, "How did you know that?" I just sat there. I didn't know what to say. Scared out of my mind, she dismissed it eventually, but I've never forgotten the experience. I'm an atheist and don't believe in the supernatural at all. I don't think I'm psychic, but how would I know what was in that book? Not 2 years later, I had another very different yet eerie experience that I will never forget, and as I revisit it now, it still creeps me out. I was raised Mormon, and yes, I was one of the missionaries that goes door to door selling religion. I happened to be sent to England on my mission, and at the time was in an area called Kings Norton, south of Birmingham. We weren't having a lot of luck, and were looking at a map of the area and saw a small village a bit of a distance outside of the main city. We checked our area book to see if anyone had been taught down there and saw no record. The next day we took a lengthy bike ride that had a long stretch of just countryside until we finally started to see it. Now, I had been in the country for over a year and had a pretty good idea of what British architecture looks like. This village looked nothing like it. I remember the buildings looked really modern and spaced out, which, if you know England, that's not usually how things look. There was this wide brown building near the center with a lot of windows. Out front was many small round tables, each with 3 or 4 people sitting at them, all drinking tea. As missionaries, we were used to stares, but the way they looked at us was different. It wasn't curiosity or annoyance as we usually see, but instead it was just flat, emotional, long stares. It was also dead quiet, as if someone pressed the mute button for the area. Stares and silence. Creeped me out. Odd thing was, the other missionary I was with didn't seem to care or seem bothered at all by the very strange place and situation we found ourselves in. I, on the other hand, couldn't shake it. Something was seriously wrong about where we were at. To me, it felt like I had walked onto a movie set. Everything had a slightly unrealistic quality to it. Too perfect. The people might as well have been robots. Everyone just stared. We eventually made our way to a small neighborhood which was surprisingly void of people. It was as if the sole residents of the village were at that building in the center. We knocked at a door and no one answered. Second door, nothing. At this point, I am nearly shaking from freaking out so bad. I tell my companion that I think we should leave. I didn't feel like we were in danger, but just the strongest feeling of being out of place. He gets annoyed and says we should stay. I keep pressing the issue, and the more I talk about it and point things out, he says I'm just seeing things and need to stop being so dramatic. After about 10 minutes of back and forth, I finally made up that the Holy Ghost was telling me that we should leave. He gave up and we left immediately. He was angry and muttering the whole way out, but once we made it back to the main city, he acted like nothing had happened. I brought it up later that day and only got a, "Yeah, that was weird," from him. We never went back and he never brought it up again, but I've never forgotten. Fast forward 12 years later to today, as I was thinking this over at work and about to prepare to post it here. On a whim, I pull up Google Maps to find the village. I can still see exactly where it should be on the map. I went to that point and there's nothing, just a road. I spent nearly half an hour scouring Google Maps all around the southern Birmingham area trying to find it, but nothing. Where were we? Did we glitch into a future part of England that wasn't meant to be there yet? Who were the people and why did they look at us so strangely? I hope all of this makes sense. I would be very interested in your thoughts on these. I've never talked with people about them before, but never forgot how they felt. This happened in 2015. I discovered a long time ago that certain actions can induce strange consequences or bizarre glitches in everyday things. Often these bizarre events or occurrences are on the very edge of being glitches. Something about them strikes one as peculiar or unsettling, as if reality, but for a moment, has been overturned and the myriad sinews of it have been exposed. This story is about one such occasion. I had gotten into a habit of doing erratic, habit-breaking actions, producing a pattern of behavior and then abruptly altering it. My thesis was simple. If reality was artificial, the appearance of ordinary life, being a facade, could be displaced by the puncturing of normality in a particular way. So I quit my job as a lawyer, quit the profession entirely. I told people when they asked me what I was going to do now, something else, and I joined the ranks of the unemployed. I left a religion that I had been raised in and was devout for many years and joined one antithetical to my upbringing. I would go to grocery stores and collect random items and place them in other locations in the store just to see what would happen. I would purchase odd things like playing cards and perform magic tricks for strangers that wouldn't pan out. Over time, I began to notice strange things happening. For example, I tossed my phone into a park near my home, a large, wooded park near the airport, and subsequently my mother was contacted by a member of the military who claims they found my phone while walking in a frigid, wet park in the middle of nowhere, returning it a few days later untouched. I took a completely unplanned flight to Toronto from a smaller city. When I arrived, Toronto was unrecognizable from the air. It was 90% wilderness. When I arrived, a Chinese woman walked right through me at the airport and continued as nothing had happened. Once on the ground, I went about my ordinary business and noticed cashiers in a McDonald's in downtown Toronto speaking Russian to customers. Walking about downtown Toronto, whenever I would ask any stranger a question, they would respond, "I'm going home." After one of my convenience store's outings, I was followed by about a dozen men in military uniforms acting like robots out of the store. I later saw a military uniformed serviceman at my place of worship. After another one of my seemingly erratic outings, purchasing objects like dirty magazines and other tidbits for the purposes of placing said objects in random locations, such as my place of worship, I was confronted by the religious authority at the place of worship. He then proceeded to tell me everything I had done that day in complete detail, as if he was omniscient or was observing me, despite that being impossible. He later, at a religious ceremony, abruptly told everyone that they didn't have to be there, even though participation in such services is mandatory in this religion, and promptly walked out. Out of curiosity, I tried to leave the country on an unplanned flight. I purchased a ticket and planned to drive 3 hours to Ottawa to attend a passport office to renew my passport. Halfway there, I decided to have a nap in my car, exhausted. I pulled up the highway and parked my car on the side of the road. I fell asleep. I woke up 3 hours later with my head under the car behind the rear tire, 5 random people standing around me. This was in the middle of nowhere in rural Ontario. These people claimed that they had found me that way, which was impossible as the door to my car was locked, and they had to call the police. They refused to let me leave. The police arrived. They forced me to go with them to a nearby station. I was told that I could not leave until I had family pick me up. They brought me a Subway sandwich for lunch and put me in a jail cell without explanation and held me there until I missed my flight. Suffice to say, I believe that the system resists us acting out of character. It compels us to follow the plan, sometimes even with force. I've since rehabilitated myself and play the role I've been assigned, if only so that I can live in the relative peace and quiet complacency offers, convinced of the inherent oddness, perhaps even odiousness, of this reality. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Be sure to subscribe and click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r Let's Read Official, and give and receive feedback from the community, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And join my Discord to interact with me and other listeners directly. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations for just $1 a month on Patreon, and maybe even pick up some Let's Read merch on Spreadshirt. Links in the bio. Thanks so much, friends, and I'll see you again soon.